So good morning, everyone. We'll start shortly. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on our breakfast briefing this morning. I'm Sarah Lethbridge, and I'm the Director of Executive Education and External Relations here at the Business School. If you have any inquiries about any training, we're delivering lots online at the moment, then please do get in contact with me, lethbridgesl@cardiff.ac.uk. My telephone number's there as well. Also, if you wanted to discuss any events that you'd like to plan, we're trying to be as active as possible in this period, and online is a great vehicle to deliver all sorts of interesting information sessions, so please do get in touch. In terms of the next events that we've got coming up, I'm delighted that Dr. Jane Davidson, who is the former Education and Sustainability Minister for Wales, is going to be talking about what Wales is doing today, the world will do tomorrow. It's a new book that she's got out about the creation of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, so please do join us for that evening event as part of our Cardiff Business School book club series. There's another opportunity to hear about all of our wonderful professional programmes, 1 p.m. Tuesday the 9th of June. That's going to be just a live webinar session where we go through our 3 programmes. I'll talk to you about that in a second. Wednesday the 17th of June, Professor Andy Henley in the Business School and the Federation of Small Businesses are coming together to look at rebuilding small business in Wales, following, hopefully, us all getting out of this lockdown period. And Thursday the 2nd of July, Dr. Jane Lynch, a procurement expert here in the school, is going to be discussing the latest Future Generations report and how we can procure well-being. That's with Sophie Howe, the Future Generations Commissioner. We're also working on some exciting events. I think we've managed to get the Chief Executive, James Timpson of Timpsons, to come and talk to us on one of these sessions, which will be really interesting, a great company. So look out for more information about that when it comes available. In terms of our information session, I'll be going through our Executive MBA, fantastic block talk programme, which would be great to sort of, if you're thinking about your career right now, a really good opportunity to look at a broad spectrum of different business skills to help you make that next step in your career or facilitate a change in career. Rachel Williams will be talking about our part-time MSc in Human Resource Management, and Catherine Farrell talking about the Masters of Public Leadership. So please do join us Tuesday 9th of June at 1 p.m. if you're interested in any of those programmes. We've also got a free virtual CPD summer school which is happening, which should be quite exciting. I'm really impressed with the range and diversity of all of the different topics, and yes, I'm going to be there talking about lean, so and how lean could be helpful in the COVID-19 crisis. So please do sign up for those, book your spaces. It should be a really interesting, as I said, free activity, so get involved in that. This webinar is being recorded. If you'd like to put any questions through to Dr. Jonathan Preminger, then please do so. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, which I will be monitoring. We're also live on Facebook today, which is pretty exciting. We'll see how that goes. And please do send forward your questions and Jonathan will answer them at the end of the session. So I think that's it from me. If I'll now hand over to Jonathan to begin his talk, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, so good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk. So broadly speaking, what I want to do today is introduce an idea, really, a fairly broad idea, and then talk about a mechanism that would help us apply that idea, how we can actually make use of that idea. Now, the idea that I want to talk about has implications for policy, implications for the world that hopefully will emerge at some point from the pandemic. And it's built on a lot of comments and thoughts of many other people. It's not really our idea. People have been thinking about life after lockdown. The mechanism I want to introduce is really just an illustration of how that idea might work. And in fact, the mechanism that I'm talking about is almost endlessly adjustable. to take into account the different circumstances that organizations face, different organizational structures, the different needs, etc. Just before I continue, I want to acknowledge my partner in crime, Dr. Guy Major. Guy is from the University's School of Biosciences, and outside his regular university duties, he's long been interested in things like workplace democratization and alternative forms of ownership. In fact, Guy was more involved in the numbers side of things. So if you want the nitty-gritty details of anything I'm talking about today, you should probably go to him, because I'm going to be talking more at the level of ideas. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Graham Nuttall from the law firm Fieldfisher. Probably many of you know that Graham was instrumental in putting together the Finance Act of 2014. This was the act that paved the way for the recent surge of interest we've seen in employee ownership. We spoke to Graham a number of times over the last few months, and he's been very, very helpful with comments and suggestions, bringing to bear his knowledge of tax law and legislation in general. So we really owe him a lot of gratitude. And in fact, many others have spoken to us about this, taking time to read over our proposal, give us feedback. And I mention this because I think academic research is very much a collaborative effort. And this aspect is often insufficiently acknowledged. So it's important for me to say that. But having said all that, I will, of course, take responsibility for any errors that you pick out from what I'm saying today. So I'll start with some maybe even banal observations and background. And I do this because it's important to understand where we're coming from with this proposal. Many people have talked about pandemics showing up the weaknesses, the inequalities in our society, and of course COVID-19 is no different. We've had decades of cuts to public services, we've had austerity policies since 2008, and we've seen huge swathes of the population left without any real financial or health security. And in fact, even before the pandemic, we heard calls for reform, particularly calls expressing a certain frustration for what we might call an extreme form of shareholder capitalism. We see these kind of calls from across the political spectrum. We see them from the heart of the establishment, including the British Academy, by the way, which has a project called The Future of the Corporation. So the British Academy is talking about more inclusive forms of ownership, how we can revert the corporation back to what they call its original social purpose. And there's been calls for more democratic control of organizations, including in the public sector. So this pandemic is often seen as an opportunity for introducing legislation, for nurturing different social norms. But the way we define, or the way we frame a problem, and of course the kinds of solutions that we're proposing, we in general, it's going to impact very much on the society that emerges from the pandemic. So what we favor in terms of solutions will depend very much on the kind of society that we envision, the kind of society that we aspire to. In other words, this is a political question, a political issue. It's not just a technical issue of what works. Now, of course, those who enjoyed the status quo ante would have us believe that a country's response to this kind of crisis is just a technical question. They want to re-establish the status quo. But we have to remember that any response to any crisis has costs as well as benefits. And the question of who pays those costs as well as who benefits is very much a political question. And we saw that very much in the crisis of 2008. We saw firms, financial institutions going down like dominoes, and they were saved by what was probably an unprecedented state intervention. And yet these kind of bailouts left most of the basic structures intact. So we could say this was a kind of a massive, coordinated, global effort to rescue a capitalist system and re-establish it pretty much as it had been before. Mariana Mazzucato, writing at the end of March, she put it this way. She said, "We must avoid the mistakes of the post-2008 era, when bailouts allowed corporations to reap even higher profits once the crisis was over, but failed to lay the foundation for a robust and inclusive recovery." That's a quote from her article on Project Syndicate. Now, in this current crisis, we've already seen vast government spending. Probably this is going to continue, at least in the foreseeable future. So the question must be, what are the likely outcomes of this spending? Who's going to benefit in the long run? And how will our society and economy be changed by this kind of intervention? And in fact, we see leading mainstream publications, things like the Financial Times, The Economist, they're all calling for a complete reset of the economy. They see this pandemic as an opportunity to address a lot of burning issues, even things like climate issues and inequality. So even these publications are saying that any assistance given should come with strings attached regarding different issues and sustainable forms of recovery. So we have to ensure that the governments are held to account with the way they intervene, but we also have to ensure that they have the ideational resources to think differently, to think about the options that they might have. And I think this is where civil society comes in. And it's also one of the roles, I think, of research institutions, especially one which dedicated to public value in the way that Cardiff Business School is. So that's the background then. And I'll say a few words about the problem as we see it. And I say the problem, but actually we're concentrating on just a very small part of this problem. And I won't go into the macroeconomic details. I'm sure everyone's aware. A deep recession is likely to be upon us. The Bank of England is talking about it. Some countries like Japan are apparently already in it. We've seen sharp drops in retail activity in the UK, unsurprisingly. The UK economy shrank by a record 5.8% in March this year. We have respected firms, common household names like British Airways, Marks and Spencer just a week ago, I think, losing their investment grade status. So we can see what kind of world we are possibly facing. And the government steps to assist were rapid, quite impressively rapid, in fact. And while these steps are very varied, and they're changing all the time as well, we want to address the issue of debt. And the reason for that is debt or loans, apart from furlough pay, loans are really the main assistance being offered to most firms. However, even before the pandemic, corporate debt was already very high. So we've seen this relentless focus on dividends, which also reduced reinvestment, squeezed wages. And now, according to many commentators, much of the money being injected into the economy is likely to end up in the hands of the banks and the large tech firms and the large companies, which probably means that pre-existing divides, pre-existing socioeconomic inequalities are likely to be reinforced or even aggravated. And again, 2008 gives us an example of what happens when you flood the market with unconditional liquidity. Most of this money went back to the financial sector, exacerbating inequalities, and as I said before, leaving the globalized capital system pretty much on the same footing. So what this means is firms are likely to emerge from the crisis even heavier in debt, straight into a deep recession. And this debt will, of course, affect their credit rating. Firms relegated to junk status face even higher borrowing costs, even greater burden of debt. And the people most likely to bear the brunt of this kind of debt is going to be the workers in those firms in the form of wage erosion, pay cuts, probably dismissals too. Also, firms' efforts to repay debt are liable to impact things like reinvestment, which will undermine the firm's ability to ensure an optimal mix of labor and capital, which will further weaken the firm. So we're getting into this kind of vicious circle of debt, if you like. So that's kind of the problem in broad terms. Now, one of the way around this problem is equity investment. In other words, firms paying variable dividends, depending on success, instead of having to service the debt. Now, this is a very well discussed idea. We're not the first to talk about this at all. The Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, Mary Somerset Webb talked about the risk that these kind of loans offered to firms may actually push these firms over the edge. So she was suggesting these kind of loans be converted to equity. We're very familiar with the idea of governments holding stakes in important firms, usually the big ones, so why not the smaller ones too? So she says these loans should be converted to equity and managed for public benefit. She also notes that there's no real need for the state to rapidly sell these kind of equity stakes on. They could be retained by the government, by the state for the longer term, possibly in a kind of sovereign wealth fund of patient capital or something like that. Others have called for state holding companies to support SMEs, buying a stake in them and reselling when the economy recovers. They've talked of social wealth funds to acquire a range of public assets. In the Observer last weekend, Will Hutton was suggesting implementing some kind of permanent workplace engagement in return for equity-based support from the state, again by some kind of sovereign wealth fund. On Saturday, the Times economics editor, Philip Aldrich, he was talking in similar terms, defining the most pressing issue that we're facing at the moment as how to deal with all that extra borrowing, in his words. So he says SMEs are likely to emerge with 2 or 3 times more debt than they had before they went into the crisis. And then the president of the British Chambers of Commerce, Baroness McGregor Smith, she was suggesting a salary for shares scheme. So this would be a way to increase employee ownership in return for state supports, in return for cuts to wages. The problem with this, of course, is that workers might find it very hard to take wage cuts at the moment. They'll be struggling too with all this pandemic going on. They might be very wary of accepting this kind of bargain if they think the firm is in trouble anyway. So from this point of view, an injection of external capital would be more helpful. So in short, we agree with this general idea that equity will serve better than debt because it doesn't need to be repaid, because its repayments aren't a fixed burden, it explicitly shares in risk. So in line with this kind of thinking, we propose that debt be converted to share financing. As firms emerge from the pandemic, they should be given the option to swap government-backed debt for tradable equity shares. Now, these shares would initially be held by the government, we're suggesting, but I'll say a few more words about that in a minute. But first, there's a couple of aspects that must be considered. So firstly, many firms are likely to want to retain control of their businesses. They won't want to cede control to external holders of traditional voting shares. Secondly, and relatedly, potential investors are likely to be wary of investing when they don't have any control over their investment. So we have a potential clash of interests here. And thirdly, we like to see this step, any kind of assistance offered, we want it to be used to develop and support a different ownership structure, something like employee ownership or something like that, one that of itself leads to improved productivity, but also to a more equitable wealth distribution and greater democratization of businesses. So we're proposing a mechanism that explicitly locks together the interests of current owners, workers, and investors. And investors here, we're including the government, at least initially. And this mechanism that we're proposing leaves control of the firm in current owners' hands, possibly also the workers' hands, but it also protects the investors. So what is this mechanism and how would it work? The core idea is actually very simple. What we're saying is the firm's value added, in other words, sales minus labor costs. This should be split between workers and investors using a pre-agreed formula. So when the firm does well, both workers and investors get to benefit. And the risk, of course, is shared between workers and investors too. So workers, by making efforts to increase their own wages, are automatically working in the interests of investors. Now, I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute, but this basic idea can be adjusted to suit differing circumstances and, crucially, to fit with existing ownership structures, such as employee ownership or employee ownership trusts and this kind of thing. So, for example, a basic fixed wage could be deducted from the value added, so that at least some of the workers' take-home pay is stable, is predictable. But still, some component of the wages would still be variable, and workers would share in the success of the firm. So technically, we could say we could define the firm's surplus as the value added remaining after fixed basic wages are deducted. So then we take that surplus, we split it into a number of equal slices. Each worker gets a pre-agreed number of these slices, which is effectively their variable pay. And each share gets one slice, which is effectively the dividend. So again, by working to increase their variable pay, the workers would also be maximizing earnings per share, and so automatically working in the interests of investors. Now, in return for unpredictable wages, we propose that workers should be given greater participation in management, or even a more radical iteration would be democratizing the management of the organization. Again, we're not suggesting here a panacea. This isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of model, but there will certainly be organizations which benefit from a more democratic management model. And indeed, there's a lot of research to suggest that there's substantial advantages of having profit sharing together with employee ownership and the democratization of management. In other words, workplace democratization, if done right, can also benefit outside investors, not just the workers. I'll say another word about that in a moment. So we're calling these shares non-voting surplus sharing shares. They would be tradable, which would offer investors a natural exit strategy, and this would be very important if the government was to be the initial investor, say via the banks or something like that. So then the government could sell off those shares at some point in a secondary market. In fact, the government should set up and facilitate and regulate this kind of market. Or the government, the state, could also keep some of them, or all of them, even in some kind of sovereign wealth fund or something like that. Now, the non-voting aspect of these shares is important because it enables this idea to be combined with a very broad range of ownership structures, including employee ownership, so that the benefits of those kind of ownership structures are not undermined. As I noted, there's a lot of research suggesting that employee ownership and participation in management improve productivity in what you might call a mutually reinforcing way. There's also a growing body of evidence showing the benefits in terms of a firm's sustainability and resilience, in terms of overall income, worker job satisfaction, worker health, and all of these stem from a combination of profit sharing and employee ownership, along with some kind of participation management, some kind of democratization of management, and an ownership culture, which I won't go into that today. So sustainability, resilience, worker satisfaction and health, these are precisely the things that a firm will need in the months and years following the pandemic. And again, the current control of the firms, including any benefits from employee ownership, any benefits from workplace democracy, these would not be undermined because the surplus sharing shares would normally be non-voting. Ownership is separated from control, and investors are protected via this explicit value-added sharing formula. Now, external investors may be wary of company directors taking bad decisions. So again, as part of this idea that this mechanism is actually very flexible, we could mitigate that risk, for example, by giving investors voice rights. So they could feed in their expertise, their advice, their suggestions, so the firm could benefit from the expertise of investors, their experience. We could also have investor voting rights kicking in temporarily, at least, after a period of sustained losses, for example, to help the firm get back on track. So there's many things, there's many ways we can play with this, many details, many parameters that can be adjusted here. But the key to our proposal is this idea of shared risk and shared benefit between workers and investors, but maintaining the control in the hands of the directors of the company or the worker owners. Now, I should also say that this idea of increasing worker control, increasing engagement and ownership in the broader sense of the term, this is very much in keeping with the spirit of the times. So probably many of you are aware that Westminster has given employee ownership its explicit blessing. I mentioned the Finance Act in 2014, amongst other things. And again, this is across the political spectrum. This is all the parties have some form or have given some support to this idea in general terms. And the devolved governments in Scotland and Wales have been very keen to support this kind of diversified ownership. Another reason is that we see firms where employees have a stake and have an ownership culture in the firm they're working. These kind of firms tend to be much more firmly rooted within the local communities, much more supportive of a range of non-financial objectives, more concerned about all sorts of issues, green issues, ecology, more in favour of greater equality. So for all these reasons, we'd like to see our version of debt to equity swaps firmly linked to increased employee ownership, linked to some kind of democratization or participation in management, and not merely a way to share risk and gain. So to conclude then, this debt to equity swap combined with this value added surplus sharing non-voting share mechanism that we're proposing would greatly reduce the debt burden faced by firms emerging from the crisis. It would thereby increase the chances of survival for these firms, thereby also protecting jobs, of course, so that the burden and risk doesn't fall disproportionately on workers. And at the same time, this proposal goes some way to a more equitable distribution of wealth. Crucially, it locks together investor interests with worker interests, but still leaving control in the hands of the directors or the workers. And for this reason, like I said, it can be applied to a broad range of ownership structures, including employee ownership, employee-controlled firms, and crucially, there's a very broad scope for flexibility, so it could easily be combined with various other vehicles like sovereign wealth fund, for example. And we would even go further and say that a more radical proposal should in fact condition government-backed investment on some form of employee ownership, some form of worker participation in management. So I've put up some links on the screen there to a couple of articles we've discussed, where we've discussed the mechanism in greater detail. If anyone wants to know the sort of the nuts and bolts of how we're proposing this works. So one is on the Cardiff Business School blog. You'll find that very easily. The other is a fully peer-reviewed and open access article in an academic journal. And at the bottom there, I've put up a link to a much more general presentation of our idea. It doesn't go into the mechanism in any great detail, but it does give the overall idea of what I've been talking about this morning. As I said, we're in close discussion with practitioners in the field, people like Graham Nuttall from Fieldfisher that I mentioned earlier, people in the Employee Ownership Association, the Wales Cooperative Centre, Anne Tyler from the Ownership at Work. So many of these kind of people have already been exploring alternatives and trying to translate them into policy-ready proposals. And we're very, very happy to acknowledge that we need these people, we need these discussions, we need this kind of expertise and experience to iron out the proposal and also to make it compatible with existing legislation. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to think about, for example, how these kind of proposals might link up with enterprise management incentives, share incentive plans, or any other kind of individual share ownership structures, and of course, the employee ownership trust, which is becoming very popular. I'm also aware that talking pure mechanics is unlikely to get us very far. We need to wrap all this up in some kind of persuasive narrative, a culture of employee involvement within the firms. We need to develop it, nurture it. Again, this isn't us saying this, many people have been talking about this. It's not enough to share profits or dividends. It's certainly a good step, but we need more than that in order to ensure productivity and commitment of staff. So this is really a very long-winded way of saying, please do get in touch with us. You have our emails on the PowerPoint there. We'd love to hear your views, suggestions, critiques. Of course, feel free to put us in touch with other people too. We'd very much like to hear from companies who would like to try something like this. This is interesting to them. And just to reiterate, we know this is one proposal among many addressing one very specific issue. We'd like to see it as part of a much broader drive towards what we might call a new post-pandemic normal. But we do think it touches on some very salient issues. First of all, the unavoidability of massive injection of public capital into private firms, the wisdom or even the responsibility to ask for something significant in return for this. This is public capital going into private firms. We need to have something in return for this. It responds to this urgent need for employee democracy, a need and a call that we're hearing, as I've said earlier, and it goes some way to sustainable business leading to a fairer distribution of wealth. So that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. It's really fascinating. I'm going to stop sharing now, and we've had several questions come into you, Jonathan, if that's okay.
That's fine, yep.
So one we've got, how do lines of devolution cut across this proposal? Which parts could Welsh Government do unilaterally, and which parts would require Westminster to support?
Okay, that's a great question, because, as I said, we do see much more support from the devolved governments than from Westminster. Westminster came up with this Finance Act, among other things, but really in terms of an overall, let's say, enthusiasm and support for these kind of things, we're seeing very much in Wales and Scotland. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of how much authority the devolved governments have to push these kind of things independently, but there are certain organisations which can do that. So in Wales, we have the Wales Cooperative Centre, which is also dealing with things like employee ownership. And we have certain development funds. Again, I don't know enough about the legislation to know exactly what kind of authority they have. But they certainly have the desire to do it. So I would say that the devolved governments is a very good place to begin with to push these kind of ideas.
Thank you. And how do you think your proposals could or should be applied to the current distress that Rolls-Royce and British Airways are facing right now, where potentially, it could be said that perhaps their basic model's broken?
Right. I don't know what's happening in Rolls-Royce. I don't see why it shouldn't work for something like British Airways. I understand that they're talking about enormous layoffs, but let's say that the problems that some companies will face, this won't necessarily help them. I mean, if there are certain companies which have to be downsizing, I don't think something like this can necessarily help. There's many other sort of solutions or ways of supporting these kind of companies, or more importantly, ways of supporting the employees who are affected by these kind of downsizing steps. I'm not saying that what we're proposing will necessarily work. But if we have a company which is struggling on, and has a commitment to retain the workers, and is receiving some kind of debt injection of capital, then this would work on the assumption that they're willing to make the step and make the commitment to, or from our point of view, the important thing would be making the commitment to more employee ownership, or at least employee participation.
Okay, great. So we've had a question here. We're an SME with a very young workforce. Variable wage in return for shares, which aren't tradable as they're a limited company, has limited appeal potentially for young people facing high living costs. Can you think of any other incentives or point to any other research that might help persuade younger colleagues to take part in this sort of initiative?
In terms of other research, I think my best answer would be get in touch with me through my email, and I can certainly point you out other research which discusses these kind of ideas, rather than try and pull out some names from my sleeve. Okay.
What else have we got? We've got so how quickly do you think we could get moving with this? Government money is being spent right now in enormous amounts, and potentially that spending will be over in 6 months, and then the cupboards will be bare. How do we get these ideas into practice right now?
Well, that's why we're doing our best efforts to push this out as much as we can. We have had interest from particularly the Welsh Government, or certain people within the Welsh Government, and we're talking in every form we can, we're publishing in every form we can. We've had the interest of very central people like Graham Nuttall, as I mentioned. So we're doing all we can to push this idea out there, and we would like very much if you push this idea as well to anyone who has contacts anywhere within the decision-making circles. How quickly it can happen? government moves slowly, but we've seen that government is capable of moving quickly when there is a crisis to face. So let's just keep pushing it.
Okay, great. And we've had a question from Facebook, so I'm just excited that I'm able to say that. Jeremy Corbyn recently talked about ownership sharing models, particularly regarding the BBC. He suggested staff elections for senior managers. Have you got any thoughts on that particular point?
My own thoughts separately would be, I think it's a wonderful idea. I think that there should be. I mean, this is just one sort of form of a more participatory form of management. You can almost call it, you know, a first step towards a democratization of the organization. So I'm very much in favor of this. And there's no reason why something like that shouldn't work with our idea. And like I said, we would like to link this kind of commitment of equity capital, an injection of equity capital. We'd like to see it linked to a commitment to a more participatory form of management. Yeah.
Okay, so do you have a sense of what sort of businesses that you could see this really working for? With the questioner has sort of said, from his experiences, the average person doesn't really want a share and a say in running the business. They want to earn their money and go home and not have to worry about all of the complexities of you know, senior management making decisions. So that extra stress on workers might actually affect their mental health, I suppose. Have you got any thoughts on whether people actually want to be that involved in business?
It's a very good question. I've been doing a lot of research in the last couple of years on companies that are owned by their employees, employee-owned companies. Without going into too much detail, a lot of these companies, the way they've been developing in recent years, include quite a significant element of participation in management. Not all of them. Some of them are simply sharing in the success of the company in a very financial sense. But a lot of them do have or are dedicated to some kind of participation. Now we see that, you know, you have a company of 500 employees. Not all of them, and even a majority of them, are not going to be that interested in the day-to-day running of the company. Most of these companies anyway retain a very hierarchical kind of operations on a day-to-day level. So the participation comes perhaps at a higher level, at overall vision of what the company should be and where the company should be going. But again, not everyone is involved, and I think we can say that about any kind of democratic or participatory system, including general elections. I mean, so many of us are not involved in politics, and we have no wish to be. That's fine, but it's important that these structures are there for those who do wish to be involved. And just the fact of having that participation, it does seem, again, that I'm not saying that this is unequivocal. You know, there's a range of research out there giving various answers with various nuances, but it does seem to be that having the option of participation in management or some kind of democratization of the organization structures increases a commitment to that organization, even if people are not actively involved in those structures, and it increases the possibility for that organization to take a wider range of objectives into account. So it becomes an organization with a certain identity, and part of that identity is not just making money, not just the bottom line. I hope that's somehow answered the question.
Great, thanks. And also a question, what response have trade unions had about this proposal? Are they in favour generally?
Right. If anyone has links with trade unions, we'd love to use them. I haven't had any responses from trade unions. It's a big gap in my research, actually, how unions are responding to this. I do a lot of research into unions. I have done in the past, but I haven't managed to make that link yet. So thank you for reminding me. It's on my list of things to do.
Okay, and I think Jenny Rathbone is very keen to talk, so I think I've worked out how to enable you to talk, Jenny.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, great. Sorry, I'm juggling lots of technological things at the moment. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I just wanted to go back to the issue of Rolls-Royce and British Airways, which is all about the fact that there are going to be a lot less people travelling by air, and many of us would say, hurrah. But clearly, for the workers in these highly skilled workers in these industries, it's how could we use this equity stakes model to, if you like, move from swords to plowshares. You know, that we definitely don't need as many aeroplanes, but we are going to need an awful lot of things to enable us to carry out the green revolution that Ed Miliband was talking about earlier this week. So how could that equity stake model be used to really to sort of repurpose a company like that whose old business model is broken?
First of all, I agree with you completely that, and I guess this is part of what I was saying earlier, that the kind of solutions we have for the people affected by these kind of changes are not necessarily directly connected to the things I've been talking about this morning, but I like the swords into plowshares idea. These people have skills. We need those skills for the developments, particularly a Green New Deal or whatever it would be. I don't know if our particular contribution, this mechanism, is necessarily in itself relevant to what you're talking about, but I do think that a general participatory aspect of participation in the firm's management does seem to enable more flexibility and more commitment to the organization, which means that these organizations probably could have greater potential to move to another field, greater potential to make use of the skills that the organization has, even, you know, from the people it's employing all the way up to the equipment it may have, to repurpose all this for something else. So from that point of view, I think it's very important that these organizations are seen as almost like communities with a certain identity, that the people working within the organization have a commitment and identify with the organization they're working for, and then they can move together, taking care of each other as colleagues within the organization, move together towards a different use for that organization.
Thank you. And can I ask the final question, Jonathan? Where does this work really well? What sort of best practice organisations can we look to show us the way?
I would say that the best practice organisations, well, first of all, there's nowhere where our specific idea is being implemented yet. So,
oh, okay.
So that we don't have a best practice. What we do have is a range of organizations which are doing very well in terms of employee ownership and participation in management. That we have seen, and there is a range of research showing how that does seem to work. And it's important to remember that the employee ownership was given a very big boost with the Finance Act of 2014. There's reasons now for companies for owner-founders of companies to pass on the organization to the people working in it. And I mean reasons, and there's a range of reasons. One of them, which is anchored in the Finance Act, is a range of tax breaks for the owner selling and for the owner workers who are receiving the company. So we've seen, like I said, a surge of interest in this form. It's within the Employee Ownership Trust. That's kind of the organizational structure that it comes in. And we've seen very successful companies going that route. It's possible that it's early days. I mean, this surge was after 2014, so we're talking 5 or 6 years really of this happening, which isn't a long time in terms of company fortunes, but it does seem to open the way to success for the firm. And I would say that's where we see the overall idea working. The specific aspect of our mechanism, like I said, we don't know whether it's going to work in that way.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us today. It's quite a tricky job for me technologically. I've got multiple screens and I'm trying to figure everything out. So if you've got any feedback about how the sessions work, then please do let us know here at Cardiff Executive Education. We'd be really interested. I didn't even know if it was possible to allow people to speak on this Zoom webinar software. So let us know if you'd like the opportunity to actually talk on our next event. That'd be really helpful for us. Please do remember that we've got lots of events coming up. And yeah, thanks ever so much, Jonathan, for your fantastic inspirational talk. I really hope that we're able to use this crisis to promote new ways of working, innovations that really try and redress the hideous inequality that exists. So hopefully your ideas will get some traction and that we can really make a difference. So thanks ever so much for joining us, everyone, and see you at the next event.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody.
Thank you.